Hey everybody, thanks for coming. We have Dr. Murphy here. He's going to talk in a minute, but first, just a few housekeeping issues. I see a lot of familiar faces, but there's people who haven't been involved with the Institute before. You know, what is the Nassau Institute? It's what we call a libertarian think tank. What does that mean? More freedom, better economy, lower government, lower regulation, so we all can live in relative freedom, relative prosperity. You know, who runs the Institute? There's a small board, committed people, very ethical, very practical people. How is the Institute funded? There's different donors who are concerned, just like yourselves, about the economy, about the Bahamas, where it's going. We've had about 200 donors over the last 15 years. They're all generally Bahamian, generally concerned people. Dr. Murphy brought two of his books that are on sale tonight. One is Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, and one is the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression, and that's what he's going to talk on tonight. Dr. Murphy will sign it for you. I think he will. So they're $20 a piece. We have limited amounts of each one. Also, we're going to pass around the sign-up sheet. You can put your name, your email, and your PO box, and we'll stay in touch with you with reports. We have an email every week, and we have mailings every so often. Without further ado, Dr. Murphy. I'll read his brief bio. Dr. Murphy has a PhD in economics from New York University. He taught at Hillsdale College before working as an analyst at Laffer Associates. Dr. Murphy is now an economist at the Institute for Energy Research and Senior Fellow in Business and Economic Studies at Pacific Research Institute. He is the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism and the newly released The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. Dr. Murphy has published several peer-reviewed articles in economic journals and has written hundreds of pieces for the layperson.
Thanks, Damien. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. I'm glad that I actually didn't adjust the microphone for Damien, because then I would have felt inadequate coming up here and pointing at my bald spot. So when I do these talks, I've been doing these a lot with my book coming out, and I go around various places. And of course, the first thing you always say when you get up there is, "Hey, it's great to be here." But this is one of the few times when I can sincerely say, it's great to be here in the Bahamas. This is really nice. I'm very grateful for the invitation to come down here. It's funny, I was talking to my dad, because I have a young son, and I was dropping him off with my parents in Florida before flying down here, and he was just baffled. He said, "Who the heck is going to go to the Bahamas to go hear you talk about economics?" And I had to explain, no, some people actually live in the Bahamas, and it was a very puzzling thing for him. So it's a new experience for us in that respect. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is partially the history of the Great Depression. So that is going to, my book, of course, as you can imagine, focuses on the U.S. experience, and so I'm going to relate that to what happened during the Depression, because the theme of my Depression book is that everything that happened during the late 1920s and then the 30s is being repeated now. And I realize that's a cliche, but it's really true, and as I'll try to explain tonight. And that shouldn't be a good thing. The same policies they put in place back then, thinking, okay, we've got this thing all wrapped up, and no, it led to a decade of stagnation, the worst U.S. performance and U.S. economic performance in its history. That's exactly the sort of policies they're putting in place today. And as I'm sure you all know, that it's not unique to the United States. In terms of the difference between the rhetoric and the ideology and the trends, what they're doing now in Washington, D.C. is probably the most extreme switch relative to, say, 10 years ago. But even so, around the world, all the major governments are moving in that direction. And ironically, because the free market U.S. is doing it, so it must be a good thing, right? Because everyone knows that the U.S. economists are the smartest ones and they know how to run the world. And so, the fact that they're saying we need bigger government to fix things, that's sort of an impetus. It's just to give an idea of how upside down things have become. I was on a radio show, and they were, and I was making some of the points I'll make later on tonight, talking about how what they're doing in Washington is the exact wrong thing, and you don't fix a period of overconsumption and too much credit spending by having the biggest deficits in history. You don't fix overspending by overspending. You're making simple points like that, and the radio host said, "Well, gee, how come more people aren't saying this, or anyone saying that to the people in Washington?" And I said, "Well, yeah, former communist countries, they're the ones telling the people in Washington, or the people in China, they're the ones telling the DC politicians. So it's this strange situation we're in where the big intellectuals in the U.S. are the ones pushing for big government, whereas the formerly communist countries, it's some of their politicians and the European politicians telling the U.S. that, wait a minute, we think you're going too quickly. So I'll make some of those points tonight, and then at the end of my formal remarks, I'll try to tie things into the Bahamas and what you can expect to see here based on the sort of trends I'm talking about, and then I'll leave some time open for Q&A if you want to get specific questions and answers there. So before we can really talk about what's the right thing to do in terms of why are things so bad right now and what should the government be doing, or are they doing the right thing, I think we need to step back and try to understand where did this crisis come from. And the same thing, if you want to understand the Great Depression, I think before you can start talking about the proper remedies, it's helpful to realize where did it come from. So I don't know exactly what you were taught here in your schools, but certainly in the United States, the standard story for what happened in the Great Depression is that it was the failure of the free market. That during the 1920s we had complete laissez-faire capitalism, unregulated markets, people could do whatever they wanted on Wall Street, banks could make loans, and people could go buy stocks on margin, and there was no limits at all. And of course that just led to this wildcat boom, and then it blew up in everyone's face. And then Herbert Hoover, so the conventional history goes, President Herbert Hoover, who was in office at the time when the stock market crashed, he just sat back and did nothing, because he was this ideological proponent of laissez-faire, and he sat back and did nothing. The economy plummeted, unemployment went up to 25%, and then finally, this official story goes, FDR was elected in 1932, he brought in the New Deal, which was this huge increase in government programs, and that's finally what got the U.S. out of the Depression, right? So that's the official story, and as I point out in my book, that's just every single point in that narrative is wrong. And it's, you don't have to go to obscure websites to get secret information to see that it's wrong. You can just look at the conventional statistics. So the things I refer to in my book, most of it's available online, and most of it comes from U.S. government websites. You can just go look at the budget figures and tax rates and things like that and see that this official story doesn't make sense. But before really getting into what did Hoover do and what did FDR do, I think we should just take a moment and try to understand what actually happened. Why was there this great stock market crash? So to do that, what I believe in is it's called the Austrian business cycle theory, and I know some of you may not have heard that term, so let me just explain what that is. The Austrian School of Economics, that term, it doesn't refer to people studying the GDP of Vienna, it's just a historical term because the people who belong to this school of thought historically came from the country Austria. So that's what the term means. Nowadays, I know many of you are familiar with the work of the Ludwig von Mises Institute in the United States. And so Mises was a prominent Austrian economist in the 20th century. Friedrich Hayek won the Nobel Prize in '74. He was also a prominent so-called Austrian economist. They tend to be very free market, and for our purposes tonight, one of their main contributions was their explanation of where business cycles come from. And so that's where my starting off point is here. So to understand that, first we need to realize that in a market economy, prices, they mean something. They communicate information. All right. So the fact that a pound of steak has a higher price than a pound of hamburger, that refers to to real things in the world. It refers to people's preferences. It refers to the cost of productions, things like that, the underlying scarcity. Okay. So if the government comes along and it passes a law and says, oh, no, now steak has to cost the same price as hamburger, that would screw things up. That would cause distortions because those prices really mean something. Now, the same is true for interest rates. So in the Austrian view, interest rates actually mean something, and specifically, they have to do with coordinating activities now and in the future. So just to give you a real simple example, let's say you've got an economy and it's settled down and everything is all interworking and it's in a stable state, and then people decide, you know what, we have a bunch of kids and we need to send them to college down the road. So what do? They stop going out to eat so much and they start saving more. So among all the other changes that will happen, you'll see that interest